Get ready to meet a Special Forces Army Intelligence Veteran who will talk about 5 shocking paranormal cases that can't happen but did. Case 1, Ghostly Apparitions, Mysterious Case of Mary Schwartz. Case 2, Remote Viewing, The Astounding Case of the Russian Submarine. Case 3, Near-Death Experiences, The Shocking Case of Mary Neal. Case 4, Psychokinesis, The Amazing Case of the Bending Forks. Case 5, UFO Encounters, The Incredible Case of Chris Bledsoe. United States Army Colonel John B. Alexander always had a special interest in the paranormal. During his long military career, he was part of Army Intelligence and researched many unsolved mysteries. He investigated from near-death experiences and psychokinesis to remote viewing on the existence of UFOs. Now that he's retired, let's see what he has to say regarding these 5 shocking paranormal cases. So sit back and get ready to be blown away.
I have been interested in phenomena throughout my life and I can't explain it. Also, I would say I never had an epiphany, a life-changing event. It's kind of more like steering an aircraft carrier where you see gradual shifts and certain things came to pass. Now, one of them, when I was getting ready to do my doctoral degree, had to do the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She brought hospice to the United States. Her stuff goes back to the end of World War II, and she talks about going into Majdanek, which was one of the extermination camps. But she's Swiss, a Swiss triplet, actually, and had gone there. This is before even she's a doctor or later went to medical school and became a psychiatrist. But this is where said she noticed on the walls in the barracks were these people who knew they were going to be executed and would see these the outlines of butterflies, and that became her symbol. Was the transition from the larvae to the butterfly being set free.
And now, let's begin exploring ghostly apparitions and the mysterious case of Mary Schwartz.
It turned out that Elizabeth became the head of my doctoral committee. What had happened was that she was giving, had a standard conference that was run on what they called life, death, and transition. Now, I had already heard about Elizabeth and this whole topic of near-death experience that she and Raymond Moody were talking about. It was just barely breaking into, popular thought. And I attended one of those. It was very unusual in that about half of the people were medical professionals, doctors, nurses, etc. About a quarter of the people were like me, just kind of interested in the generic topic. And the other quarter were dying patients. I mean, you talk about, emotional involvement when you have I heard firsthand, it's kind of well known, the Mary Schwartz case. What had happened was that she's now a medical doctor and she's teaching at the University of Chicago. And she'd done this for a while and she's decided to quit. I've had enough of this. The elevator comes and then there's a woman standing next to her. And she says, let's go. And so the woman takes her to her office and she opens the door for Elizabeth and they go in and she's going, damn, I think I know this problem. Why do I know her? And then it dawns on her, this was one of her patients who had died sometime before. And so she said, could you leave a note? And she writes the note and signs it for Mary Schwartz. And they have later, because this is now a known person, and we're able to do graphic analysis and say, yep. The other thing was that discussion ends, she walks out and said, here's this long hall. And she kind of shakes it, says, this is doing reality checks. This just doesn't happen. Runs out the door, and she's gone.
If you like this first case, then get ready for more as we uncover the truth about remote viewing and the astounding case of the Russian submarine.
I went to Command and General Staff College, and I wrote an article called The New Mental Battlefield. I was talking about the remote viewing and all those other things. I was at Command and General Staff College, which was not terribly, stressful. So I wrote the article, and it talked about psychokinesis and remote viewing and those sorts of things. I wrote it in '79, and it doesn't come out until December 8th. As you know, the remote viewing program became a formal program. It turns out to be valid. As you know, in the remote viewing, there were things that had come in. Well, the classic one is Joe McMoneagle and the Russian submarine. We had remote viewing information about Russian submarines. And he talks about a huge Russian, well, he had been given coordinates and says, can you tell us what's inside the building? And he says, well, here's this big submarine and it's double hulled, and by the way, the tubes are forward of the sail, and a whole bunch of new things. And our boat builders and people said, nonsense. If you built something that big, when it went to depth, it would crush. And we don't have any information about the radically different design. And he had said, well, X number, there's going to be a trench dug and whatnot. And sure enough, the skies cleared up, the cameras came on, and there's the big ass, what's now known as a Typhoon class submarine. And we had totally missed it. And that's when we went back and said, yeah, we had the information. They just refused to accept it. I had no hope that the article would get published, in a military journal, but I submitted it to Military Review, which is a straightforward military journal, and they've never done anything like this in the past. Again, coincidentally, it turns out that the editor of Military Review had a near-death experience, so he had no doubt about that. So instead of just being an article that he agrees to publish, it becomes the cover article. So the article comes out, frankly, barely ripples inside the military, but a journalist by the name of Jack Anderson, who wrote for the Washington Post and was syndicated and all that, he picks up on the article and he writes a nasty article called "The Voodoo Warriors in the Pentagon." Wow. So all of a sudden, it now is making, because it hit the Washington Post, it's now getting a lot more play. And at that time, I'm assigned in the Pentagon. I was an inspector general, literally in the bowels of the Pentagon, literally in the bottom floor, sitting there and assigned. I get invited, it's rather circuitous route, to meet the Deputy Secretary of Defense. It's about 12:30 on this particular day. And so Richard Stillwell is the number two and number three in all of the Department of Defense, and it's through a wide channel, but I get invited to meet him. And so I'm discussing with him and said, he says, well, where do you work? And I said, well, I'm an Army Inspector General and that and all. So that goes for 40, 45 minutes, and I left. And well, that was interesting. So I go back to my office down in the base of the Pentagon, basement of the Pentagon. And all of a sudden, about 4:20 that afternoon, the chief of staff of our office, the Army Inspector General, comes in and says, tomorrow morning, you don't work here anymore. And so, because frankly, from the time I made Lieutenant Colonel, I was never assigned in the system again. I was always moved from general to general, literally handed off.
Next, let's uncover the truth of near-death experiences and the shocking case of Mary Neal.
IONS had just been formed with Bruce Grayson and Raymond and Ken Ring and Mike Sabum. And so Ken Ring's book came out, which was the first real discussion of the topic. I mean, Life After Life by Raymond was out, but Ken was now talking about doing studies on near-death experiences, and I read that. But now I'm assigned in Washington in the Pentagon, and so I had contacted them, and it's literally in the formative stages, and I got invited up to meetings they were holding in Storrs, Connecticut, which was within driving distance. So went up and met the board that had just been formed, and then just got invited to join the board. And like I said, the rest is history. The problem with most near-death experiences is they're totally anecdotal. And they happen sometime they're remote. Were they close to death or not? No, that's why I like Mary Neal's case, because there's no doubt that she died, physically died. Her case happened there in South America. She's kayaking in Chile, and in a remote area, northern Chile, and goes over the waterfalls the last day, and they're going in trail, and she's the last person to go over this particular waterfall, gets blocked, goes underwater, and the kayak gets jammed about 10 feet down. And she's totally stuck and cannot move. Now, there's a quick release, but the problem is the force of the water on top of her. She cannot reach the quick release. So what happens eventually is that her legs break above the knees. If you can think of bending the wrong way, and she gets washed out. And she's underwater, we think 35 minutes. We know that most of that time she was the importance there is you can't hold your breath that long. So there's nothing like she was in an air pocket or somehow had the breath. They go downstream and find her body that had been washed ashore, bring her back up. Two guys appear out of the wilderness there, and they get her on. There's a whole series of miracles that happen, but they get her on the kayak, which they finally release, and they carry her to the waiting ambulance at the road. This is an area of Chile that has no ambulances, let alone that it would be in a remote road waiting for them. And then a whole series of other things happen. She goes out and talks to God, and she had 4 small children at the time. And one of the things she's informed is something no mother would ever want to hear, and that is, when your son is 17, he's going to die. And so she doesn't say anything about it. So a year before, when he's now 16 years old, she finally tells her husband that she had been given this premonition. And sure enough, he turns 17. He's out skateboarding on a street, and the inadvertent driver comes down. There's a series of them, zigs one way, misses one, comes back and hits and kills him. Now, when I talked to her last, which was about 2 years ago, I guess, she said that she still has things that have not yet come to pass that she's been told, but a number of them have. Most of them are very personal and not related. But so here you have the series of physical miracles, including a moved rock, people that they went back to the area and checked that these guys are not known to the local community at all. She will say, attribute them to being angels. And then they say physically taking her to the ambulance that doesn't exist, that takes her to the hospital, which does, and then goes through, of course, the recovery. It took years to recover because of the damage to her legs. She's an orthopedic surgeon in her own right. And then information, years forward that proves to be accurate.
Can we bend metal objects with our mind, or is this only an illusion? Get set to explore the mystery of psychokinesis and the amazing case of the bending forks.
And this is where these things start crossing over in ways. Jack Houck is the guy you've probably heard about, the metal bending things. So what happened is we're having a party where I had seen Jack once. Had invited him to my apartment in Northern Virginia, and we are having a session. If you know, Andrea Poharich was there, if you know that name, but that goes back into antiquity too. Another medical doctor who'd been studying these things, and Gaiman was critical because a friend of Ted Rockwell brought her in. He was a nuclear physicist who had worked with Rickover creating literally the nuclear navy, but was interested in these phenomena. But and Gaiman is, we're in a circle. We get to the graduate session. We hold up two forks. And anyway, so she happens to be sitting right across from General Stubblebine. We're on the floor in there, and all of a sudden her fork goes bloop, and just falls over 90 degrees. And that's when Bert and I said, "Oh shit," go off and say, this is serious. We need to take a look at it. So we had worked with Anne. Here's Anne Gaiman doing psychokinesis. Her main thing was being a medium. We was the Army Intelligence Security Command, which was a global command. And we had colonel level commands all around the world. And every quarter, every 3 months, he would bring in his colonel commanders, and they would plan, what are you going to do? What are we doing? And coordinate things. So there was a session that happened. This was after, I had worked with Jack Houck now, and I had gotten pretty proficient at actually teaching the metal bending or spoon bending thing. So we did have a session with all of these colonels and some generals and whatnot. And I'm running a session, and so we do the normal bending. It takes about an hour. We go through we get to the senior course where you're holding two metal forks just like this. And what happens was this one fork falls over. I am the one who's running the session. This is just one of those. It turned out to be that was a lieutenant colonel, and he's got it, and it falls over 90 degrees, which I didn't see. But the senior people around did see it happen. But then with his yelling, and I'm frankly worried they're trying to set me up, but the thing comes back up, goes back down, and it comes about halfway and stops. And he put it down and he said, I wish that hadn't happened. And as a matter of fact, in that thing right behind me is that fork. Because what happened was he put it down and said, it literally scared the crap out of him. And fortunately, we were sequestered and we had a shrink with us because we had to put him back together. He happened to have been one of our European commands and sent him home. Now, the intent, I kept saying, so what are you going to do, bend tank barrels? I said, no, computers. Now the intent for these commanders was not to get them to bend metal. It was, do not disregard things just because you don't believe it. We have been blindsided. Remember, this is the bad old days, Soviet Union. And we'd been blindsided several times by the Soviets. And when you went back and looked, you found out the information had been there, but generally been ignored. And the people had just said, now that can't happen, so, it's got to be nonsense. Well, it turns out some of it wasn't. Remember, Sputnik was the big one that came up when the satellites were out. So the message to the commanders was not go out and bend metal or psychokinesis works. It was understand the limits of your belief system and don't use those as blinders when you get information that you don't understand. You always look for corroboration, of course, but we wanted them to quote be open-minded on the topic. When I say we demonstrated all these things, the metal bending and remote viewing, there were a lot of people who did not like that. I told you the individual who did that particular bend, it scared him. And then at the highest levels, we of course ran into some religious objections. We ran into, you can do that, but it's the work of the devil. You should not. Those are very real complaints. His position, Sullivan's position, became literally untenable in the Army. And he resigned or retired basically for the good of the Army because it was definitely hurting the Army.
Colonel John Alexander begins his book UFOs, Myths, Conspirations, and Realities, sustaining that UFOs are real, and ends it saying that whatever this is, it's more complex than we can possibly imagine. So get ready to discover the amazing truth about UFO encounters with The Incredible Case of Chris Bledsoe.
And my more recent book, Reality Denied, is the first chapter of Skinwalker Ranch. The second one is the Chris Bledsoe story. And that's the one, I had one minor sighting a number of years ago. That's when I was with NDEs, though I was up in Washington. But that was not a major thing. What happened with Chris, and I should say these continue. I mean, I'm still talking to him. I got new videos this week, so it's going on. But his case, by the way, if anybody interested, he wrote UFO of God. And that's the one like mine. And I wrote the at one of the two forwards for that book. But what happened was I had met Chris, had interviewed him, and the story is long and convoluted and all of that. We went out to visit him. He lived in near Hope Mills, North Carolina. So we went back to where the original incident had happened. And so it was getting late in the afternoon. My wife and I and his daughter all went down the river and he joined me. So we came back up. It was just getting dark. Victoria and Emily get in the car, and Chris and I are leaning against the left front fender, and he's going, well, here's where this happened, here's where that happened. And all of a sudden he goes, oh, I think they're here. And with that, the thing pops into view and goes zipping off. And I saw that. But it was the temporal relationship between him saying, I think they're here, and disappearing. It was a few seconds. There's a program called Beyond Skinwalker Ranch that we did, and there's a segment on Chris. I'm in that segment. But I thought the most interesting piece of that was they brought in a helmet, an EEG helmet, electroencephalograph, and they split camera. The one screen is showing Chris pointing to the UFO. Another screen, well, there's orbs, actually, is what he's saying. Another screen shows the orbs he's pointing to. And the third screen is of the EEG that's taking place. And what you see is this tremendous shift. And it looks like this is a Zen meditator with 30 years experience on it. And Chris is not a Zen meditator, but you see commensurate with him saying it's here, saying a thing, and a huge brainwave shift at that point. The point is that people have reported interactions between humans and sentient non-humans throughout the entirety of human history and in all cultures, and that they fly in little tin cans is a fairly new wrinkle to it. And of course, you have the obvious problem, but you probably can go superluminal, but lots of things. How can you get from here to there? Given the time it takes, a number of late years to move something, and all of that, those kind of problems. Well, first of all, I come down against the ETH, or the extraterrestrial hypothesis, not because the events don't happen, but because that answer is too simple. If you're talking about something that's co-located, ultra-dimensional, for instance, all of those problems, physics go away. And then you get back to what we were talking about earlier, after-death communication, and it looks like there are a lot of similarities there as well. Well, what I would refer you to there is what you mentioned earlier before, the last paragraph of my UFO book. It is more complex than we can possibly imagine.
If you also believe that our reality is more complex than we can imagine, then it's time to watch this video and get ready to be blown away.
This has been the AJ Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe.